He was 22 and out of options when he stepped off a Greyhound at the bus station in Wallace, Idaho, on a Sunday afternoon in late September, with $30 in his pocket and a backpack that contained, by inventory, 3 changes of clothes, his grandfather's Connecticut pattern felling axe wrapped in an old denim shirt, and a folding knife his mother had given him for his 18th birthday in the last spring she was alive. He had no plan past the next 24 hours. He had no family he could go back to. And by the end of that week, with 28 of those $30 still in his pocket because an old packer named Hutch had refused his money the first night and made him sleep on a cot in the back of the outfitter loft for free, he had bought a Forest Service fire tower lookout, abandoned since the summer of 1973, on a ridge in the Bitterroots, for $1 plus a written promise to patch the catwalk before the first heavy snow. The east side railing was rotted clear through. The Osborne firefinder in the center of the hexagonal cab was wrapped in canvas, but what nobody knew was that under the balsa wood floor of that hexagonal cab, in a compartment that hadn't been opened in 51 years, was a fire log that would change his life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Wes Olin had been moving toward the mountains his whole life without knowing it. He was born in Allentown, Pennsylvania, in a brick row house 3 blocks from the old Bethlehem steel rail spur, the kind of street where the same families had been living in the same houses since the war. His father left when Wes was 7. There was nothing dramatic about it. He took a job in a warehouse in Lancaster and stopped coming home on weekends, and then stopped calling. And within a year, he had become a man Wes mostly read about in court filings his mother kept in a manila envelope under her bed. He saw him twice after that, both times by accident. Once at a gas station in Bethlehem when Wes was 11, and once at a diner in Hazleton when Wes was 16, and both times his father had looked at him with the specific kind of polite confusion that you see on the face of a stranger trying to remember whether he ought to know you. Wes had stopped trying after the diner. His mother, a quiet woman named Carol, who worked the day shift at a county clerk's office in Allentown, had done her best with what she had. She had taken Wes to Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina every August from the time he was 4 until the summer he was 13, when the car gave out and she could no longer afford to fix it. He remembered those weeks better than anything else from his childhood, sleeping in a borrowed canvas tent at a campground outside Brevard, walking the trail to Looking Glass Falls, watching his mother sit on a flat rock by the river in the early morning with a paperback in her lap and her shoulders relaxed in a way they never were at home. She had grown up on a hardscrabble farm in the western edge of Pennsylvania, where her own father, Wes's grandfather, had worked as a civilian conservation corps enrollee at a CCC camp on the Cherokee-Nantahala border country in the southern Appalachians, from the spring of 1937 to the autumn of 1939, building trails and culverts and a small fire tower in the high Balds country that Wes's mother had taken him to see when he was 9. The old man had died before Wes was born, but he had left, among other things, a Connecticut pattern felling axe with a hand-carved hickory helve, the head still bearing the Forest Service inspection stamp from the summer of 1938. Wes's mother had given it to him on his 16th birthday, wrapped in a denim shirt that had also belonged to the old man, and had told him, without sentiment, that it was the only thing of value she had left to pass on, and that she hoped he would use it for what it was made for, instead of hanging it on a wall. He learned to use it. There was a small woodlot behind the row house, a half-acre of red oak and hickory that had somehow survived the post-war development of the neighborhood, owned by an older man named Roy who lived 2 doors down and who let Wes cut firewood in exchange for stacking it on Roy's back porch. Wes spent most of his Saturdays from 16 onward on that woodlot. He learned how to fell a tree against the lean, how to read the way a hardwood log wanted to split before he set the wedge, how to dress a beam with a draw knife. Roy, who had worked 38 years as a tool and die man at Mack Trucks before he retired, taught him the things a hardware store clerk would never know. He taught him that a Connecticut pattern head was hung at 33 degrees and not 28 because it was designed for the eastern hardwoods, not the western softwoods, and that the difference mattered when you were splitting white oak in February. He taught him how to file a cross-cut blade with a raker gauge so the teeth dropped the chip cleanly instead of dragging it. He taught him that wood was a system, and a system could be worked if you understood how it wanted to move. Wes's mother died on a Tuesday in March of his 19th year, congestive heart failure. She had known for 2 years. She had not told him because there had been nothing he could do about it, and because she had not wanted him to watch her wait. He found out in the manila envelope under her bed, alongside the court filings and a small life insurance policy that, after the funeral and the unpaid medical bills, left him with $1,140 and a row house he could not afford to keep. He sold the house to the landlord who had been renting to her for 19 years, who gave him a price that was fair and not generous, and he moved into a one-room above a print shop on Hamilton Street and took a job at a warehouse in the industrial park east of town, packing and shipping religious books for a small denominational press that paid $11 an hour and gave him a discount on Bibles he did not particularly want. He worked there for 3 years. It was steady work. It was not hard. The warehouse manager, a man named Dan, who had been packing crates for the same press for 26 years, was a decent man who never raised his voice and never asked Wes anything personal beyond whether he needed a ride home in the rain. Wes kept his head down, learned the systems, and saved what he could. By the time he was 22, the $1,140 from his mother's policy had become $1,230, mostly through the combination of refusing every restaurant meal and walking to work in every weather. He kept the money in a coffee can on the top shelf of his closet, an old Maxwell House can that still smelled faintly of grounds, which he had cleaned with bleach the day he opened it. On a Wednesday afternoon in late August, Dan called him into the small, glass-walled office at the back of the warehouse and told him that the press had been bought by a larger publisher in Grand Rapids and that the Allentown warehouse was being consolidated, effective the following Friday. He apologized. He gave Wes a severance of $412 and a written reference. He shook Wes's hand the way men shake hands when they both know they are not going to see each other again. Wes walked back to his row house above the print shop and sat at the small folding table in the kitchen and looked at the $412 in his hand and at the coffee can on the top shelf of his closet and at the Connecticut pattern axe leaning in the corner by the door, and he understood, with a clarity he had not felt before, that there was nothing in Allentown that wanted him to stay. The print shop downstairs was closing in November. Roy had moved to a son's house in Quakertown the previous spring, and the woodlot had been sold to a developer. His mother had been gone 3 years. There was no one in the city who would notice if he left on a Greyhound the next morning, or stayed until November and left on a Greyhound then. The choice was his, and the choice was easy. He had been reading about the Bitterroots for months without knowing why. The Allentown Public Library had a small reference shelf in the back of the second floor, 3 short rows of mountain literature and Forest Service histories that no one ever checked out. And Wes had been working through them on his lunch hour for over a year. He had read Norman Maclean's A River Runs Through It twice, and Wallace Stegner's collected essays, and a short Forest Service monograph from the 1980s on the L4 fire tower lookout standard the Forest Service had settled on by the early 1930s. He had no plan to use any of this. He had been reading the way a man reads who is trying to learn a place he has never been, but has somehow always known about. The way you learn the shape of a word in a language you do not speak. There was, in the back of the monograph, a small directory of preserved lookout sites, county by county, in the northern Rockies. Wallace, Idaho was listed under Shoshone County, with the address and phone number of a packer outfitter named Hutch, who, the monograph said, kept an informal register of abandoned USFS sites in the Bitterroot National Forest, and who could be contacted by anyone interested in the inventory. Wes called the number from the small reading room phone in the back of the Allentown Public Library the morning after Dan let him go. A man answered on the 4th ring with a voice that was older than the phone line. Wes told him what he was looking for. Hutch listened without interrupting. When Wes was finished, Hutch said, "Come out and we'll see." That was all. The line went dead. Wes packed everything he owned into a backpack and a duffel bag, which was less than he had expected when he started. 3 changes of clothes. The Connecticut pattern axe in the denim shirt, his mother's folding knife, the paperback Maclean, a small framed photograph of his mother on a flat rock by the Davidson River in Pisgah, taken the summer Wes was 9, a copy of the Forest Service L4 monograph he had checked out and never returned, with a note inside the front cover apologizing and a $5 bill folded against the title page. The coffee can. The whole life weighed less than 50 pounds. He sold his mother's car for $600 cash to a man at a body shop in Bethlehem who paid him in 20s from a metal box and asked no questions. He bought a Greyhound ticket from Allentown to Spokane for $212 with a transfer in Chicago, and he gave the rest of the cash, after the ticket, a sandwich, and a paperback for the road, to a woman who had lived in the apartment below his and who had 3 small children and a husband who was not coming back. He did not tell her his name. He left the envelope with the cash on her front step on the morning he left. The ride west was long. Pennsylvania rolled into Ohio, rolled into Indiana, and the land flattened out into Illinois, and Chicago came at midnight in a roar of lights and concrete, and he sat in the bus station for 4 hours waiting for the transfer with the Connecticut pattern axe at his feet and the coffee can in his lap. Then the bus pulled west again, and Iowa rolled into Nebraska in a sea of dry corn, under a sky that opened up the way prairie sky opens up to a man who has never seen it. And Wyoming came at sundown the next day with the Laramie Range showing dark on the southern horizon. And Idaho came on a Sunday morning with the Bitterroots showing themselves through the bus window in a way that made him put down the McLean for the first time since he had opened it. And look, he had never seen mountains like that. He had seen the Smokies, and he had seen the Catskills once on a school trip, but he had not seen the kind of mountain that did not bother to look beautiful because it was too busy being itself. He arrived in Wallace at 3 in the afternoon. The bus station was a small, concrete building beside a Conoco station on the edge of the town's old silver mining grid, with mountains rising on 3 sides and the Coeur d'Alene River cutting a green seam through the canyon to the west. He stood on the sidewalk with his bags and the axe and the coffee can, and he looked at the mountains for a long time before he went inside the Conoco and asked the clerk if he could use the office phone to make a local call. The clerk passed the receiver across the counter without a word. Hutch answered on the first ring this time. He said he was on his way. He arrived 20 minutes later in a dented Ford F-100 that was the color of old paint dust. A man in his early 70s with a gray beard and the kind of face that had been working in mountain weather for so long it had stopped registering anything that was not weather. He looked at Wes's bags. He looked at the axe. He looked at Wes. He said one word: get in. The outfitter shop was on the south side of Wallace, a long, low building of dark-stained pine with a hitching post in front that had not been used by paying customers in 20 years, but was still kept in good repair because Hutch hated rotted wood. Inside, the shop smelled like canvas and leather and saddle oil, and the particular faint bite of bear spray that had aged in its cans on the back wall for several seasons. There was a small counter at the front with a glass display case of brass compasses and old USFS map sets. And behind the counter, a wood stove with a kettle on it that was always on a slow simmer. A black and tan hound named Dixie, 15 years old by the gray on her muzzle, came out from behind the stove to sniff Wes's boots and then went back to the warm spot on the rug and did not get up again. Hutch poured Wes a cup of coffee from the kettle without asking if he wanted any. "Your name's Olin," Hutch said. It was not a question. Wes Olin. Olin, like the old keeper. "Sir?" Hutch looked at him for a long moment over the rim of his coffee cup. Then he set the cup down on the counter and walked to a wooden cabinet on the back wall and pulled out a manila folder, and he laid it on the counter between them and opened it. Inside were Xeroxed pages from a Forest Service personnel file, with a black and white photograph clipped to the top page. A young man in a USFS uniform standing on the catwalk of a fire tower lookout, hands in his pockets, looking past the camera at something in the middle distance. The caption under the photograph, typed on a long, dead typewriter, read, "Olin Brace, Lookout Keeper, Striped Peak Lookout, Bitterroot National Forest, 1948 to 1973. You any relation?" Hutch asked. Wes looked at the photograph. The man in the picture was tall and lean and had a long jaw that Wes recognized from a small wedding photograph his mother had kept of his grandparents, which she had hung in the kitchen of the Allentown row house, and which had been one of the few things Wes had taken with him when he sold the house. The man in the wedding photograph, Wes's grandfather, looked almost exactly like the man in the USFS file. Not the same man. The set of the eyes was different, the mouth was different, but the bones were the same. "No, sir," Wes said. "I don't think so. My family's from western Pennsylvania." Hutch said. He looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he closed the folder and put it back in the cabinet. Probably nothing. It's not an uncommon name. But I called you back because of it. When you said Olin on the phone, I figured maybe you'd want to know about the lookout. What lookout? Striped Peak, about 40 miles south-southeast of here, on a spur of the Bitterroot Main Divide. USFS retired the road to it in 1962. Lookout went dark in 73. Forest Service has been carrying it on the books as an inactive structure for 51 years. Last year, they decided to dispose of it. Taxback fees come to $940. They'll take $1 from anybody willing to take on the patch obligations. Hasn't been a taker. Most people who want a fire tower want one with a road to it, or one in the lower 48 where they can drive an RV and put up a satellite dish. Stripe Peak is a 4-hour hike from the nearest USFS spur, on foot, with no road of any kind. Not for the soft. I told the Forest Service I'd keep an eye out. Wes set down his coffee. How much for the patch obligations? You pay the tax back from your own pocket. You patch the east catwalk before first heavy snow. You do not touch the Osborne firefinder. You file a structural condition report with the district by April. After that, it's yours. You sign a quitclaim agreement on the patch terms. The Forest Service signs the dollar deed. The district ranger told me anyone willing to put a written promise on the catwalk patch could have it. He paused. But the dollar has to be cash. Government bookkeeping. I have $940, Wes said. I have $1,230 in a coffee can in my backpack. I have $1 in my wallet. Hutch looked at him for a long time. Then he turned and looked at Dixie on the rug behind the stove. Then he looked at the wall behind the counter where a black and white aerial photograph of Striped Peak had been pinned for as long as the shop had been open. The lookout was a small white speck on the ridgeline of a long, dark, lodgepole-covered massif. The photograph had been taken in 1961, when Olin Brace was still keeping the tower. You can sleep on the cot in the loft tonight, Hutch said. I won't take your money for that. In the morning, we'll talk to the district. If it goes through, I'll drive you to the trailhead on Tuesday and you can hike up. You sound like you've done a little work, have you? Some, Wes said. Cordwood, mostly. Hardwood splitting. A little draw knife work on beams. You ever filed a cross-cut blade with a raker gauge? Yes, sir. You know what you're looking at when you read a USFS 7.5-minute topographic series? Elevation contours every 40 feet. Blue lines for perennial streams, dashed blue for intermittent, brown for unimproved roads, black for USFS spurs. You ever held an axe like the one in your bag? It was my grandfather's. He used it on a CCC crew in Cherokee National Forest in '37. Hutch nodded slowly. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he refilled Wes's coffee cup without asking, and he pulled a tin of pipe tobacco out of his shirt pocket and tamped a small briarwood pipe and lit it with a wooden kitchen match, and he said, All right, then. The loft is up the back stairs. Bathroom is around the side. There's a chili pot on the back of the stove that you can help yourself to. I eat at 6. You can join me or not, however you like. Tomorrow, we go to the district office. Wes carried his bags up the back stairs to the loft, which was a long, unfinished room over the shop with a single window that faced east toward the Bitterroots and a cot along one wall with 2 wool blankets folded at the foot. He set his bags on the cot. He took out the framed photograph of his mother on the flat rock at the Davidson River and set it on the small wooden crate that served as a nightstand. He took out the Connecticut pattern axe and leaned it against the wall by the cot. He took out the coffee can and set it on the crate beside the photograph. He sat down on the cot and looked at the window. The Bitterroots were already going to red in the late afternoon light. He sat there a long time. The district office was in Coeur d'Alene, an hour northwest, and Hutch drove him there in the F-100 on Monday morning with Dixie in the back seat and a folder of paperwork on the dashboard. The district ranger, a woman in her early 50s named Margaret Vellante, had been at the district for 16 years and knew Hutch the way people in small mountain districts know the men who have been packing into their wilderness for 40 seasons. She looked at Wes's identification and his Pennsylvania driver's license and his severance letter from the press in Allentown, and she asked him 3 or 4 practical questions about his work history and his finances, and whether he understood that the Striped Peak lookout was a 4-hour hike from the nearest spur, and that the Forest Service would not be coming to rescue him from a structural failure he had agreed to repair. He answered her honestly. He had $940 for the tax-back fees and $290 left over for tools and supplies and food. He had no plan past the first winter. He had no medical conditions. He had no dependents. He understood the structural condition report obligation. He understood the catwalk patch deadline. He had no questions. Margaret Vellante looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Hutch. "He's your call," she said. "It's a $1 transaction," Hutch said. "The Forest Service is the one who put the offer on the table." "I know who put the offer on the table." She turned back to Wes. "Mr. Olin, I'm going to tell you something I do not have to tell you. The Forest Service has been trying to find a taker for Stripe Peak for 19 months. The reason there has not been one is that the previous lookout keeper, Mr. Brace, kept the structure to a standard the Forest Service no longer has the budget to maintain. If you take this on, you are taking on the obligation of a man whose work was considered exceptional, even in the years when fire towers were properly funded. I have read his fire log, end to end, for the district record. Whatever else you are doing on that ridge, you will be living inside the work of a man who set a very high bar." She paused. "I will sign the deed if you sign the patch terms. I will not sign it twice." "Yes, ma'am," Wes said. He signed the patch terms with the pen she handed him. She signed the deed. She handed him a manila folder containing the deed, a copy of the original L4 plans for the cab, a Xerox of the patrol logbook covering the structure's active years through its last staffed season in 1973, and a single brass key on a faded paper tag that read, in pencil, "Striped Peak, OB 73. Hutch handed her a dollar bill across the desk. She put it in a small steel box on the corner of her desk. She wrote out a receipt. She gave Wes the receipt and a handshake, and a look that was, he understood later, the closest thing to a blessing the federal government is permitted to give. Tuesday morning, Hutch drove him to the trailhead in the F-100, 63 miles south-southeast of Wallace, on a series of progressively narrower USFS spur roads, the last 6 miles of which were single-track gravel that climbed in long switchbacks through stands of lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce until the spur ended at a turnaround with a green and white USFS signpost that read, simply, "Striped Peak, 3.8 miles. The sign was bullet-pocked. The arrow pointing up the trail had been straightened with a hammer at some point in the recent past. There was no other car at the trailhead. There was no other sign of human life within the 140 square miles of the surrounding Bitterroot drainage. Hutch killed the engine. He sat in the cab for a moment looking up the trail, then he turned to Wes. "You'll want to make the catwalk before dark. It's 3.8 on the map, but the last mile is steeper than the contour line tells you. Take this." He reached into the back seat and pulled out a small canvas pack, already loaded, that Wes had not seen him put in the truck. First aid kit, 2 days of dry food, a USGS topo, a whistle, a spare brass key in case you lose the one Vellante gave you. The L4 owner's manual the Forest Service used to give the lookout keepers in the 50s. I had a copy. You can have it back when you don't need it. Wes took the pack. "How much do I owe you for it?" Hutch looked at him. "Nothing. The first one's always free, that's the rule. After that, you pay what it costs." He paused. "I'll come up in 2 weeks to see how you're doing. If you're not at the trailhead in 2 weeks, I'll come up the ridge to find you. Don't make me do that. I'm too old to like it." "Yes, sir." Hutch put his hand out across the cab. Wes shook it. Hutch's grip was dry and strong and brief. "Good luck, Olin." Wes got out of the truck with his backpack and the duffel, and the Connecticut pattern axe lashed to the side of the duffel, and the canvas pack Hutch had given him on top of everything. He stood at the trailhead and watched the F-100 turn around in the spur turnaround and head back down the switchbacks. He watched until the truck disappeared around the third bend and the sound of the engine faded into the wind in the lodge poles. Then he turned and started up the trail. The first 2 miles were not bad. The trail followed an old USFS spur that had been retired in 1962, but was still cut and graded well enough to walk on with a heavy pack. Lodgepole closed in on both sides, with patches of huckleberry along the lower edges and beargrass blooming late in the cooler hollows. The grade was steady. He could hear his own breathing and the small sounds of his pack settling against his shoulders and, once, a Steller's jay calling from a snag above the trail. He stopped twice in those first 2 miles to drink water from a USFS-issued canteen Hutch had thrown into the canvas pack at the last minute. and to look at the way the light was moving across the ridge ahead of him. The mountains were doing the thing mountains do in late September in the Bitterroots, which is to say they were not doing anything at all in particular, except being themselves with a precision that was almost rude. The last mile and a half was harder. The trail steepened sharply where the spur had been retired, and the official Forest Service tread took over. Switchbacks climbing through a band of subalpine fir and white bark pine, with the talus showing on the south face above, and the snow line, even in late September, visible as a faint white margin along the highest peaks to the south. Wes's calves began to burn by the third switchback. His shoulders began to ache by the fifth. He set the pace he could keep without stopping, and he kept it, the way Roy had taught him to do cordwood, one swing at a time, not faster than the body would carry, not slower than it would cool. He came out onto the ridge proper in the last hour before sunset. The trail opened from the timber onto a long, narrow spine of granite and weathered sandstone that ran east-west for a quarter-mile before it terminated in the small, rounded summit of Striped Peak itself. And there, on the summit, against a sky that was turning the color of old brass, stood the lookout. The L4 cab sat on a 14-foot pyramid base of squared timber bolted to bedrock, with the steel ladder rising in 3 flights up the south face to the catwalk that ran around the 4 sides of the cab. The cab itself was hexagonal at the top, 4 paned windows on each of the 6 sides, the pyramid hip roof clad in tar paper that had weathered to a uniform pewter gray. The east side catwalk railing was visibly rotted from where Wes was standing, the wood gone soft and dark and partly collapsed inward, the way Hutch had said it would be. The west side was sound. The shutters on the north and south windows were missing. The shutters on the other 4 sides were still in place, hanging on their hinges, their once USFS green paint long since gone to the color of weathered cedar. He stood at the foot of the ladder for a long moment, looking up at the cab. The wind on the ridge was cold and steady, the kind of wind that has been blowing across the same granite for several million years and is in no hurry to stop. Somewhere down the south slope, a marten or a fisher made a small, thin sound that Wes did not recognize. He set his bags at the foot of the base. He took the brass key with the paper tag from his jacket pocket. He climbed the first flight of stairs, and the second, and the third, and stepped out onto the south catwalk, which held under his weight with the small, dry creak of seasoned timber that had been built to hold a great deal more than one young man and a small canvas pack. He walked the catwalk around to the door, which faced east. The east catwalk gave a little under his boots in the worst section, but did not collapse. He filed that observation as a matter of habit, with the part of his mind that had been making lists of things to fix since he was 12 years old. The cab door was painted USFS green that had faded to almost gray. The brass padlock on the door was the original USFS issued model, the kind made in Connecticut in the late 1940s. The shackle blackened with 51 years of weather, but the lock body itself still solid. He fitted the key Margaret Vellante had given him into the lock. The key turned without resistance, the way a key turns when the lock has been kept oiled, somehow across 51 years of abandonment. He pushed the door inward and stepped into a room that had been waiting since the summer of 1973 for someone who wanted to be there. The hexagonal cab was about 14 feet across at the widest point. The Osborne Firefinder, a circular brass and iron instrument the size of a large dinner plate, stood on a wooden pedestal in the exact center of the room, wrapped in heavy canvas the way Hutch had said it would be, the canvas tied at the base with a length of jute that was now stiff and brittle, but still intact. A small wood stove sat against the north wall, its black iron flue rising through a copper-lined hole in the roof. A built-in bunk ran along the west wall under a window. A small wooden table with 2 folding chairs stood against the east wall. Open shelves along the south wall held a kerosene lantern, a tin of matches that turned out, on examination, to be only mildly degraded, 2 enamel coffee cups, a small cast-iron skillet, and a US FSL-4 owner's manual identical to the one Hutch had given him at the trailhead. A roll-top drawer in the cab desk on the south wall held, when Wes pulled it open, a stack of yellow temperature log pages from 1973, the last one dated July 11th, the handwriting brown with age but legible. The signature at the bottom of the last log was a careful, slightly old-fashioned script in pencil. O.L. Brace. Wes set the canvas pack on the floor. He stood in the middle of the cab and turned slowly. The light through the 4 pairs of windows was the cold gold of late September at altitude, the kind of light that does not look anywhere it does not need to look. The wind on the ridge moved against the cab walls with the small, steady sound of something that knew the cab and had been waiting for it to be occupied again. He could see through the south window the Coeur d'Alene drainage opening away below to the west. Through the north window, the long backbone of the Bitterroot Range showed itself in successive ridges going north into Canada. Through the east window, the lower Selway country fell away in a long, blue-shadowed sea of lodgepole. Through the west window, the sun was going down behind a ridge whose name he did not yet know, but would learn within the week. He stood there for a long time. He felt something settle in his chest. It was not relief and it was not joy. It was the specific quiet of a thing finding the place it had been moving toward without knowing. Then, because he was a methodical young man, and because the light was failing, and because there was work to do before dark, he set about the practical business of making the cab habitable for a single night. He brought up his bags from the foot of the base. He laid out his sleeping bag on the bunk and set the framed photograph of his mother on the small shelf above it. He set the coffee can on the desk next to the temperature log pages. He leaned the Connecticut pattern axe against the wall by the door, where his grandfather had used to lean it in the kitchen of the Western Pennsylvania farmhouse 40 years before Wes was born. He lit the kerosene lantern with a match from the tin on the shelf. The flame caught on the second try. It was while he was kneeling to set the lantern on the small wooden table in the middle of the cab that he noticed, in the floor between the table and the base of the Osborne firefinder, a single balsa wood floor plank that did not sit quite flush with the others. The plank was 6 inches wide and ran the full 8-foot length of the cab. The seam along its east edge was tight. The seam along its west edge was, by perhaps the width of a fingernail, not. He set the lantern down. He ran his thumb along the loose seam. The plank moved. Outside, the sun went the rest of the way down behind the western ridge, and the wind on Striped Peak picked up, the way it does when day turns to night at altitude. And somewhere in the lodgepoles, 1,000 feet below the cab, a great horned owl began its evening call. Wes Olin looked down at the loose balsa wood plank in the floor of the hexagonal cab. He looked at the brass-handled flathead screwdriver in the open lid of the hutch's canvas pack on the floor beside him. He looked at the kerosene lantern flame, steady and gold in the cold cab air. He took his thumb off the plank. It would wait. He had been waiting for it without knowing for 22 years. It could wait until morning. He stood up. He banked the lantern down to its lowest flame. He crossed to the bunk and got into the sleeping bag with his clothes still on, the way Roy had taught him to sleep at altitude in a cold room. He lay on his back and looked at the dark hexagonal ceiling above him and listened to the wind and the owl and the small, dry creak of the cab settling for the night. And somewhere just before sleep, with the brass key from Margaret Vellante still in his jacket pocket and the loose balsa plank waiting in the floor 4 feet away, he thought very clearly that he had come a long way to get to this bunk, on this ridge in these mountains, and that the journey, when he looked at it from the inside of the cab, did not feel like a journey at all. It felt like coming home. He woke before first light the way he had always woken since the warehouse years, the body's own clock taking the place of an alarm. The cab was cold and still, and the only sound was the small, dry settling of timber that had stood unstaffed for 51 years, and was now, for the first time since the summer of 1973, breathing again with a body inside it. He lay in the bunk for a long time without moving. He listened to the wind on the catwalk. He listened to a single Clark's nutcracker calling from the white bark below the cab. He looked at the dark hexagonal ceiling above him and the 4 pairs of windows pale with the first gray of dawn, and he thought about nothing in particular, which was, he understood, a thing he had not been able to do at altitude or anywhere else since his mother died. Then he got up and made coffee on the small wood stove, using a handful of dry white bark cones from a pile that had been left in a tin pail beside the stove since, by the look of the cones, somewhere in the mid-1970s. The cones lit on the 3rd match. The flame was small, but it held. He boiled water in the enamel cup he had found on the shelf the night before and made instant coffee from a packet in Hutch's canvas pack, and he stood at the south window drinking it, while the sky over the Coeur d'Alene drainage went from gray to the color of a clean dish to the first thin pink of altitude sunrise. He took the L4 owner's manual to the small wooden table and read for an hour. Hutch had clipped a USFS pamphlet inside the back cover, mimeographed in 1964, that explained the Forest Service's two-person standard fire detection protocol. Every staff lookout in the district was to make azimuth contact with two adjacent lookouts every 2 hours during the active fire season, and to cross bearing any suspected smoke before logging it as confirmed. Stripe Peak had once made paired contact with Goose Peak Lookout to the southeast, and with Lookout Mountain to the northwest, both of which, the pamphlet noted in a hand-penciled addendum, had been retired in 1981. The cross-bearing system Brace had worked under was, for Striped Peak, a system of one. The pamphlet did not explain how a man might confirm a smoke alone. Wes set the manual down on the table. He went out onto the catwalk in his jacket and stood at the east rail, the sound section, and watched the sun come the rest of the way up over the lower Selway. The light moved across the sea of lodgepole below in a long, slow band of gold. A pair of common ravens made a circuit of the cab at eye level, working the morning thermals along the ridge, calling once to each other as they passed, and then breaking off down the south face. He could see, with the kind of clarity that altitude gives, the actual visible horizon, a far blue line of ranges fading north into the Idaho panhandle 90 miles off. The Mission Range, a sharper line, 60 miles to the north-northeast across the Bitterroot Valley. The long granite spine of the main Bitterroot Divide running south into the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, where the named ridges he had read about in the L4 monograph in the Allentown Library were laid out now in front of him, in real granite and real lodgepole and real distance. He stood there with the coffee cup going cold in his hand, and he watched. Then he went back inside the cab and knelt on the floor in front of the loose balsa plank. He took Hutch's flathead screwdriver from the canvas pack. He slid the blade into the loose west seam. He worked it slowly, the way a man works a stiff lock with a key he is not sure will turn. The plank lifted along its west edge with a small, dry sound. He set the screwdriver aside. He took the plank with both hands and lifted it free, lifting from the lifted edge and tilting the rest up gently, the way you lift a long board out of a frame without breaking the tongue. The plank came up clean. Underneath was a rectangular compartment about 8 inches deep, lined with a piece of oilcloth that had darkened with age but was still intact, and that had been laid carefully into the framing the way you lay a cloth into a drawer when you mean what is inside to keep. He sat back on his heels and looked into the compartment for a long moment before he reached in. There were 4 things in it. The first was a leather-bound notebook the size of a man's hand, the cover soft and dark with use, the binding cracked along the spine the way bindings crack on books that have been opened 1,000 times. The leather had once been black and was now a deep tobacco brown. On the front cover, embossed in faint gold script that had worn almost smooth, were the letters USFS. The second was a leather drawstring pouch the size of a baseball. The drawstring was thin saddle-stitched leather, the kind a packer keeps in a saddle kit. The pouch was heavy. The third was a small, flat tin, the kind that had once held lozenges, painted with a faded brand mark Wes could not quite read. The fourth was a single-folded envelope of heavy bond paper, addressed in pencil, in the same slightly old-fashioned script Wes had seen on the temperature log pages in the roll-top drawer. The address read simply, "To whoever finds this." He sat for a while without touching any of it. Then he reached in and took up the leather notebook first. The pages were laid out the way USFS fire logs were always laid out in the era. Date column, weather column, azimuth column, observation column, action column, signature column. The first entry was dated June the 14th, 1948. The last entry was dated September the 2nd, 1973. 25 summers of fire log, kept by one man in pencil, an occasional fountain pen, and once, somewhere in the middle of the 1960s, a careful ballpoint that had begun to fade after 30 years. The handwriting changed almost imperceptibly across the decades, the way a man's handwriting changes when he has used the same hand to write the same column of notes through 25 summers of his life. The loops a little tighter in his 40s, a little looser in his 60s. The figures always legible. The columns always squared. The signature at the bottom of each season's final page, always the same careful script. O.L. Brace. Wes turned the pages slowly. He did not yet read for content. He read the way you read a wood grain before you split it. The surface first, the structure, the way the columns dropped down each page the way Roy had taught him to read a hardwood log before he set the wedge. He saw the dates. He saw the columns. He saw the lightning strike entries clustered through the late July weeks of every summer. The smoke azimuths recorded to a single degree. The cross bearings noted in the action column with the abbreviation GP for Goose Peak and LM for Lookout Mountain. All the way through to the summer of 1980, when Lookout Mountain was retired and the cross bearings stopped, and the rest of Brace's seasons in the column became, instead, single-person azimuths confirmed by foot reconnaissance. Brace walking the ridges himself, sometimes for 2 and 3 days at a time, to confirm what no other lookout was staffed to confirm with him. He turned to the page Volante had told him about in the district office in Coeur d'Alene, though she had not told him by date, only that it was the fire log of a man whose work had set a high bar. He turned slowly until he found, on a page near the back of the third summer's binding, an entry dated September the 12th, 1963. The handwriting on that page was, even by Brace's careful standard, perfectly squared, almost printed. September 12th, 1963. Weather: cool, north wind 8 to 10 knots, falling barometer, building thunderhead cell visible to the south-southeast at 1400 hours. Lightning strike confirmed azimuth 212 degrees, distance estimated 9 miles, 1532 hours. Smoke not visible at strike point at strike time. Vegetation, lodgepole pine duff. Fuel moisture in district, last measured 4%. Cross bearing from Goose Peak negative at 1600. Cross bearing from Lookout Mountain negative at 1615. Foot reconnaissance initiated by undersigned at 1700. Did not log closed. Descended west catwalk with 12-hour pack and Pulaski and signal mirror. The entry continued in the same column the following day. September 13th. Foot reconnaissance day 1. Cross striped peak south spur at 0600. Made the head of Pinion Creek by 0830. No smoke visible from any visible vantage. Continued south along ridge toward azimuth 212. Wind shifted west-southwest in the afternoon, falling. No precipitation. The next day. September 14th. Foot reconnaissance day 2. Made head of Sherman Gulch by 0900. Confirmed first smoke visible at 1100 from a granite outcrop 200 feet above the gulch. Smoke approximately 1/4 mile west of azimuth. Confirmed from Striped Peak 2 days prior. Ground fire active in Lodgepole Duff over an estimated 3 to 4 acres. Made signal to Goose Peak by mirror at 1200. Goose Peak acknowledged at 1208. District dispatch confirmed at 1400. Engine crew arrived from Magruder Station by 1500 and contained burn perimeter to 12 acres by sundown. Estimated saved acreage, approximately 1,200 acres of mature lodgepole pine, plus drainage to head of Sherman Gulch. Undersigned descended Striped Peak via South Spur at 1600, September 14th, and returned to Lookout by 2300, September 14th. Eating jerky and creek water. Reactivated lookout duty at 0500, September 15th. End of incident report. Wes read the entry twice. Then he set the notebook down on the floor beside the open compartment, and he sat on his heels and looked out the south window at the visible horizon. At the ridges going south into the country, Brace had walked alone for 3 days at the age of 42, with a Pulaski and a signal mirror and a 12-hour pack, to confirm a smoke that 2 adjacent lookouts had said was not there. It was, in 1,200 acres of saved lodgepole pine, the most important thing one quiet man had probably done in his entire life. It had taken 5 sentences in a column. There had been no commendation in the file Volante had shown him. There had been no medal. There had been a single line at the bottom of the action column the following spring, in a different hand, the district ranger of the time, that read, "Acknowledged, M. Krause, District." That was all. I have read that page in the original notebook in the USFS Archive Annex in Missoula. The page is brittle. The pencil is faded to brown. The careful printed script is still legible. The district acknowledgement in M. Krause's hand at the bottom of the spring page is faded to almost nothing. But you can still see, in the right light, the date of the acknowledgement. March the 18th, 1964. No, March the 28th. The 8 is clearer than the first digit. 6 months after Brace walked the South Ridge alone, give or take 10 days. Wes closed the notebook. He laid it on the floor beside the compartment. He took up the leather pouch next, untied the drawstring, and tipped the contents into his palm. Coins, 8 of them. Walking Liberty $50. The silver bright and untarnished where they had been wrapped in oilcloth. Each one dated between 1942 and 1946. The years of the Pacific War. Wes held them for a moment in his hand and thought about a young Marine of 21 taking his pay in silver at a forward base on Guadalcanal or Bougainville or Okinawa and putting 8 of those $50 into a leather pouch for the same reason men have always put silver into pouches at the edges of empires, which is to say, because silver is what you trust when you are not sure you are coming home. He set the pouch down beside the notebook. The flat tin was next. He pried the lid open carefully with the edge of his thumbnail. Inside were 2 things: a small brass shield-shaped badge, U.S. Forest Service, in stamped letters across the top, a 5-digit number engraved across the bottom, the pin on the back bent slightly to one side from years of being pinned to a uniform jacket, and a stack of 7 small black and white photographs, the kind taken with a Brownie camera in the late 1940s and early 50s, each one carefully labeled in pencil on the back with an azimuth and a date. 050 degrees, North Horizon, June 16th, 1948. 125 degrees, East Horizon, Selway Country, July 4th, 1948. 212 degrees, South Horizon, July 9th, 1948. He recognized what they were before he had turned over the third one. Brace had been photographing the visible horizons from the cab by azimuth to use as baseline reference for smoke spotting in the seasons that followed. The brownies were not pictures. They were instruments. They were the visual equivalent of a fire log, except that Brace had not needed them after the first summer because by then he had the horizons in his head, the way a packer has a trail in his legs after he has walked it once. He had pinned the photographs to the inside of the cab wall above the firefinder for one summer, used them once as a reference, taken them down, and put them in the tin under the floor, where, he must have decided, they would do less damage than fading on the wall for 50 years. Wes set the tin down beside the pouch and the notebook. The envelope was last. He held it for a long time before he opened it. The paper had yellowed slightly along the edges. The pencil on the front was faded but legible. To whoever finds this. He worked the flap open with his fingernail. The letter inside was on the same heavy bond paper, folded once, written on both sides. My name is Olin Lyle Brace. I was born in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho in 1921. I served in the United States Marines in the Pacific from 1942 to 1946. I came home with things I could not put down, and I went up onto this ridge in the summer of '48 on a temporary lookout contract that ran 6 weeks. I never came back down off of it. I have kept this lookout for 25 summers. I have never married. I have no children. The men I served with on Saipan are mostly gone. My mother died in 1957 while I was on this ridge. I came down for the funeral, but I did not come down to grieve. I have grieved up here. There is no place better for it. This summer is my last summer. My back will not carry me up the catwalk after this. The war left it with a piece of shrapnel I have ignored for 30 years, and the catwalk is no longer in the mood to ignore it back. I am 52 years old. I am going to live in a rented room in Wallace through the winter, with a woman named Adelaide Brennan who runs a boarding house on Cedar Street. And in the spring I am going to a small house off of Bank Street that I have arranged to buy with what I have saved from 25 summers of Forest Service pay. I will not be coming back to the cabin any future summer. I have informed the district. They have indicated they will not staff Striped Peak after my retirement. The lookout will go dark. I am leaving these 4 things in this compartment because I would rather they remain in the cab where they belong than be put into the district archive in Coeur d'Alene, where they will be filed and forgotten. The fire log is 25 summers of weather and smoke and lightning, kept in the only way I knew how to keep it. The coins are 8 silver half dollars from my Marine pay, which I have carried for 40 years and which I have decided not to spend because there is no thing I want to buy with them. The badge is the one I wore for 25 summers. The brownies are reference photographs I took during my first summer here to learn the horizons. They are not pretty. They are not meant to be. They are work. I do not know who will find this. I do not know if anyone will. The Forest Service may sell the cab to a salvage contractor, and the contractor may pull up the floor and throw what is under it into the back of a truck without looking. That is a thing that happens. But I have made peace with that. If you are reading this, you came up onto this ridge and into this cab for a reason. Maybe you are taking the cab back into service. Maybe you are restoring it as a private dwelling. Maybe you are passing through. I trust that whoever finds this letter will know what to do with the rest. Take care of the catwalk. The east side starts to go in 73. Patch it before snow. Olin Lyle Brace. Striped Peak Lookout. Bitterroot National Forest. September 2nd, 1973. Wes folded the letter carefully along its original creases. He put it back in the envelope. He sat on the floor beside the compartment and the 4 things laid out on the balsa, and he did not move for a long time. He was not crying. His throat was tight. He thought about his mother on the flat rock at the Davidson River in Pisgah, the summer he was 9. He thought about his grandfather on a CCC fire tower crew in the southern Appalachian Balds country in 1938. He thought about a young Marine of 21 with 8 silver half dollars in a leather pouch in his blouse pocket on a forward base in the Pacific in 1943. He thought about Olin Lyle Brace coming home from that war with things he could not put down and walking up onto this ridge in the summer of 48 at the age of 27 on a 6-week contract and never coming back down off it for 25 summers. He thought also that he had been wrong to tell Hutch the name was probably nothing. He could not yet say that it was anything, but he could no longer say that it was nothing. He sat there for a long time, then he got up. He took the 4 things one at a time and laid them carefully on the cab desk, beside the temperature log pages from the summer of 73, and he replaced the balsa plank in the floor. He banked the lantern up. He swept the cab with the small broom that hung on a nail by the door. He carried the canvas pack out onto the catwalk and inventoried what he had to work with for the first 3 days alone on the ridge. 2 days of dry food, a USGS topo, a first aid kit, the L4 owner's manual, the spare brass key, a coil of 40-foot manila line, a small mortising chisel, the flathead screwdriver, a USFS issue Pulaski Hutch had left in the pack without saying anything, his grandfather's Connecticut pattern axe, his mother's folding knife, a coffee can with $1,229 in it, and the photograph of his mother on the flat rock at the Davidson River. It was, he understood, more than he had brought to Wallace from Allentown. The lookout had given him more in one night than he had owned that morning. He went down the ladder to the foot of the base and gathered the duffel and the second of his bags and brought them up to the cab. He spent the rest of the morning sweeping out the cab, scraping the worst of the rodent leavings from under the bunk, identifying the panes of glass that would need to be replaced before winter, identifying the shutters that would need to be rehung. 2 of the 4 panes on the north window had cracks. One of the 4 panes on the south window was missing entirely and had been patched, in 73, with a piece of tar paper Brace had nailed across the opening from the inside. Wes left the tar paper. He would need to source the glass in Wallace and bring it up the trail on his back. The glass alone would cost $40, and the trip down and back would take a day and a half. He filed the expense and the time against the calendar in his head. 6 weeks to first heavy snow. The catwalk patch came first. The glass came second. The shutters came third. In the afternoon, he climbed up onto the south catwalk and unwrapped the Osborne firefinder. The canvas came away in one piece, stiff and dust-colored after 51 years, but otherwise sound. Underneath the firefinder stood as Brace had left it, the brass dial intact, the pointer disc swung to azimuth 0, the leveling bubble centered, the eyepiece aperture clear. He could see etched into the brass collar at the base of the instrument the maker's mark, the small block lettering of the Portland, Oregon company that had been producing the instrument under the original Osborne design since the early 1910s, when the design itself had first come into Forest Service use. He did not touch the dial. He folded the canvas and laid it on the desk and went outside again and stood at the south rail and looked out at azimuth 212 degrees, where, 63 years before, a man named Olin Lyle Brace had walked alone for 3 days to find a fire that no one else could see. Hutch came up the trail in 2 weeks to the day as he had promised. He came alone, in a wool coat and a heavy pack, the F-100 left at the trailhead. He arrived at the cab in the middle of the afternoon, shrugged the pack off onto the catwalk, and looked at the east rail patch Wes had finished the morning before. Wes had cut 4 new rail sections from a stand of Engelmann spruce on the south face of the ridge, dressed them with the draw knife to match the original profile, mortised the joints to the original cap, and dry fit them with the Connecticut pattern axe and a mallet he had made out of a section of lodge pole the second night on the ridge. He had not used a single piece of hardware that had not been in Brace's original assembly. The new spruce was bright against the weathered original timber, but the joints were tight. Hutch ran his thumb along the cap joint. He pulled on the rail to test it. He looked along the rail with one eye, the way an old hand looks along a barrel. "That's a good patch," he said. "Thank you, sir." Hutch did not say anything else about the patch. They went inside the cab. Hutch saw the 4 things Wes had laid out on the desk. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. He picked up the leather pouch. He weighed it in his palm. He set it back down. He picked up the brass badge and looked at the 5-digit number on the back. And his face changed in a small way that Wes did not yet have the vocabulary to read but understood, after the fact, was the face a man makes when a number from a personnel file he has remembered for 40 years matches a number on a badge in his hand. "He never spent them," Hutch said. "No, sir. I read his letter." Hutch set the badge down. He looked at the fire log. He did not open it. "Volante told me what he did in 63. It's in the log." "It would be." He looked at Wes. "Brace was an old friend. He died in 78. I was 25. I had been outfitting in Wallace 4 years. He used to come into the shop on Tuesdays in the off-season, and we'd play cribbage, and he wouldn't say 20 words in 2 hours. He played hard. I never beat him in 5 years of trying. He left me his cribbage board when he died. It's on the shelf above the wood stove in the shop. I noticed it. I didn't know what it was. Now you do." Hutch sat down on one of the folding chairs at the table. He did not pour himself coffee. He looked at the photograph of Wes's mother on the shelf above the bunk. He did not ask about it. He sat for a long moment in silence. Then he said, "Brace was born in Coeur d'Alene in 21. His father was a hard rock miner. Worked the Sunshine Mine, the Bunker Hill, the Galena, the whole Coeur d'Alene district from before the war until he got silicosis in 49. Brace was an only son. His mother kept a boarding house on Pine Street. Brace went into the Marines at 20 after Pearl, Pacific. Came back at 25. Took a temporary lookout contract at Striped Peak in 48 because he could not stand to be indoors and could not stand to be in town. The temporary contract was supposed to run 6 weeks. He stayed 25 summers." Hutch paused. He used to say, in the off-season, when he was old enough to start saying things, that he had figured out somewhere in the first month on this ridge that the war had left him with a certain weight that he could carry up here and could not carry down in town. The ridge took some of it. He kept coming back because the ridge kept taking it. Toward the end, I think the ridge had taken most of what it was going to take, and he stayed anyway. The way you stay with a friend who has helped you, because not staying would have been a kind of ingratitude. Wes did not say anything. "He had a mother he loved," Hutch said. "She died in 57. He came down for the funeral and went back up the ridge the same week. Adelaide Brennan, who he later boarded with in Wallace and who was my wife's older sister, told my wife once that Brace had come back from the funeral and stayed on the ridge for the rest of the summer because down in town he could not sleep, and up on the ridge he could. There was no shame in that. The 2 months after his mother's funeral are some of the cleanest log pages in the whole 25 years. He pointed at the fire log on the desk. You'll find them somewhere in 57. He wrote everything plain. He did not hide it. After Hutch left, Wes opened the log to the summer of 1957. He found the entries quickly. June, July, the first half of August, all the careful columns. Then, near the bottom of an August page, dated August the 11th, a single brief line above the regular daily entry in the same careful printed script that read, Telegram received via Goose Peak Relay this morning. Mother died at home in Coeur d'Alene last night, August 10th. Will descend tomorrow morning for arrangements. District informed. The daily entry below it that day was, otherwise, unchanged in its careful column format. Weather: clear, south wind 5 knots. No smoke, no lightning. Cross bearing with Goose Peak confirmed at 1400. He had not stopped logging the weather on the day his mother died. The entries resumed 3 days later, August the 14th. Returned to lookout from Coeur d'Alene at 10:30 hours. Funeral and arrangements concluded August 13th. Reactivated lookout duty. Weather: hazy, southwest wind. No smoke, no lightning. Cross bearings confirmed. Wes sat at the desk for a long time after he read that page. He thought about a man of 36 in the summer of 1957, coming up off a ridge to bury his mother, and going back up the ridge 2 days after the funeral because the ridge was where he could keep doing the work. He thought about a man writing, weather, clear, south wind 5 knots, on the same page where he had just written, mother died at home in Coeur d'Alene last night. He thought about what kind of man does that. He thought about whether it was discipline or duty or love or some combination of all three for which no single word existed. He thought about whether his mother, who had not told him she was dying because she had not wanted him to watch her wait, had been working out of something like the same impulse. He thought about what it meant, exactly, to choose to stay at the post you have been assigned to in the world on the day the worst news of your life has come up the line, because the work in front of you is the only language you have left for what you are unable to say. He understood, sitting at that desk in that cab on that ridge 66 years after Olin Lyle Brace had written that line, that staying at the post was not the same thing as being unable to leave. It was a different thing entirely. It was a form of love whose grammar he had not previously had any way to recognize, and which he now recognized in his mother and his grandfather, and the man whose log he was reading and, perhaps, with a long time still to learn it, beginning to recognize in himself. That was the morning he decided he would stay through the winter. The community came up the trail in pieces over the next 4 weeks, the way mountain communities come, not all at once and not with announcement, but one person at a time, each one bringing one thing. The first was a woman named May Krause, who ran a small used bookstore on Bank Street in Wallace, and who was, as it turned out, the granddaughter of the district ranger, who had written the single-line acknowledgement at the bottom of Brace's spring page in March of 1964. She came up the trail on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of October with a jar of huckleberry preserves she had put up herself the previous August, a paperback Wallace Stegner she had been wanting to give to whoever took Stripe Peak ever since the district had put the lookout on the disposal list, and a small stenopad of family notes about her grandfather's tenure as district ranger that she thought Wes might want to see. She did not stay long. She sat at the cab desk for 30 minutes drinking coffee Wes had made on the wood stove, and she looked at the 4 things Brace had left under the floor, and she did not say much except to tell him that her grandfather had spoken of Brace twice in his life, both times briefly and without elaboration, in the way her grandfather spoke about any man he had quietly considered to be the most important fire detection officer the Bitterroot district had ever staffed. She left the preserves and the paperback and the stenopad on the desk. She walked back down the trail by sundown. The second was a retired Forest Service crew boss named Buddy Lynn, 64 years old, who had worked seasonal trail crew in the Bitterroots from 1978 until his retirement in 2015, and who had patched the catwalk at Stripe Peak twice in his career, once in 1993 and once in 2004, on contracts let by the district during the early years of the FFLA preservation push. He came up on a Saturday with a set of cross-cut blade files in a leather roll, a 1-pound box of period-correct cut nails he had been holding in his shop for 15 years against the chance that someone would eventually take Stripe Peak back into service, and a hand-drawn diagram of the original L4 catwalk rail system as it had been installed in 1942, copied by Buddy himself from a master print in the district office in 1993. He looked at the east rail patch. He ran his thumb along the joint. He nodded once. "You did the mortise by eye," he said. "I did, sir. Most of the people who patched that rail before you used a router. I don't have a router. That's not why I said it." Buddy set the files on the desk. Use these on the crosscut when you do the shutters. The teeth are filed for green spruce. Don't try them on dry hardwood, they'll skate. Yes, sir. Buddy did not stay for coffee. He walked back down the trail with a small set of measurements on the cab roofline he said he wanted to verify in his own shop notes that evening. He did not say goodbye. He nodded once at Wes from the foot of the ladder and started down the spur. The third was an 86-year-old man named Pelham Stowe, who had been the lookout keeper at Goose Peak from 1946 to 1971, and who had logged most of the cross bearings with Brace through the central 2 decades of Brace's career. Pelham came up the trail on a clear, cold Sunday in the last week of October, escorted by Hutch in the F-100, to the trailhead, and walked up the last 8 miles slowly with a single hiking stick and a thermos of coffee and a small frame pack. He was small and lean and had a face like weathered cedar, and he climbed the ladder to the catwalk without help, though it took him a long time. He stood on the catwalk and looked at the visible horizon for a long time before he went inside the cab. He did not greet Wes when Wes stepped out to meet him. He went inside the cab and stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, the way Wes had turned the first night. 25 years, Pelham said. I crossed bearings with him from 46 to 71. He retired 2 years after me. I made him a thermos of coffee once in 54, and he sent it back with a packer because he did not drink coffee. After that, I sent him tea when I sent anything. He drank tea. He paused. He kept a sourdough starter up here that he had carried in his pack from his grandmother's kitchen in Coeur d'Alene in 1948. I assume it is gone. Starters do not survive 51 years of cold. It's gone, sir. I checked the shelf. Pelham nodded. He sat down at the desk. He read the fire log for 2 hours without speaking. He drank 1 cup of coffee from his own thermos. He read every season's first page and every season's last page, and the September 12, 1963 entry, and the August 11, 1957 entry, in that order. When he was finished, he closed the log and laid both palms on it for a moment, and then stood up. You will keep this in the cab, he said. It was not a question. Yes, sir. Good. He looked at Wes. The Forest Service Region 1 Archive in Missoula has wanted a copy of this log for 40 years. They have wanted it because it is the most complete single lookout log in the Northern Rockies. I have been asking them to send a copyist up here for 30 of those 40 years, and they have always declined on budget grounds. If you will allow it, I will arrange for the regional archivist to come up next summer with a flatbed scanner and make a copy for the regional record. The original will stay in the cab. The district will have a working copy. The original belongs here. Yes, sir. Whatever you and the district think is right. Pelham nodded. He walked to the cab door. He stood for a moment looking out at the ridge. You did the catwalk patch well, he said. Brace would have done it the same way. He went down the ladder. Hutch was waiting at the foot of the ridge in the F-100. They drove back to Wallace without speaking. Wes worked through the rest of October on the cab. He sourced the missing glass on a single trip down to Wallace in the 3rd week of the month, packing the 4 panes back up the trail, wrapped in newspaper and balsa wood spacers inside the canvas pack, with Hutch's tested method of cushioning between the panes. He installed the glass in a single long afternoon, using period-correct glazing compound Buddy had given him from his own shop stores. He rehung the shutters on the north and south windows from his own bench in the cab, cutting the shutter hinges to original pattern with the Connecticut pattern axe split bench he had made on the catwalk landing. He cleaned the wood stove in the flue. He bedded the bunk with a new straw tick he had sewn himself from a bolt of canvas May Krause had sent up the trail in Buddy's pack. He stacked half a cord of dry lodgepole under the catwalk against the south face, where the snow would be lightest. His coffee can held $730 by the end of the month, after glass and supplies and the small things he had needed from Wallace. The tax-back fee deadline to the district was the end of March. He could make it. He could not waste any of it. On the night of October the 29th, a Wednesday, with the first hard freeze of the season laying a half-inch of clear ice on the catwalk timbers, Wes stood at the south window of the cab and watched a thunderhead build over the lower Selway country at azimuth 212 degrees. The cell was wrong for the season. It was wrong for the time of day. The Bitterroot lightning season had been over for 6 weeks. Late October storms in the Selway were known but rare, and they came in fast and dry, and they sometimes left fires that smoldered through the first snow and reignited the following spring on the dry south slopes. He watched the cell for an hour. The barometer on the cab wall dropped 4 points in 40 minutes. The wind on the ridge shifted from northwest to southwest. The thunder had climbed until it was visible against the last of the daylight as a column of cold gray cloud 40,000 feet high, its anvil top spreading north toward Striped Peak. The first lightning strike confirmed at the cell's base at 1850 hours. Azimuth 210 degrees, distance estimated 12 miles. The second came 40 seconds later at azimuth 214. The third at azimuth 211. The Goose Peak Lookout had been retired in 1981. The Lookout Mountain Lookout had been retired in 1983. There were no adjacent staffed lookouts. There was no two-bearing confirmation available. There was, on Stripe Peak Ridge, in the cab Olin Lyle Brace had kept for 25 summers, one young man with a US FSL 4 owner's manual and a fire log open on the desk to the September 12, 1963 entry, and a brass-handled flathead screwdriver he had used that morning to tighten the third shutter hinge. The fourth strike came in at azimuth 212 degrees, distance estimated 11 miles. Wes Olin reached for the district radio Hutch had brought up to him in his pack the previous Sunday, the one Wes had not yet used, the one whose call protocol he had memorized from the L4 manual, but had not yet spoken into. He keyed the microphone. The district dispatcher's voice came back on the radio. After a long pause that Wes timed by the second hand of his grandfather's pocket watch on the desk, because he had not yet learned how long a district pause is supposed to be. 32 seconds. Then a woman's voice, calm and slightly bored in the way that fireline dispatchers are calm and slightly bored, asked him to repeat the strike azimuths and to hold while she pulled the BLM-controlled burn schedule for the Selway South corridor. He repeated the azimuths. He held. The barometer continued to drop. The wind on the ridge held southwest. Stripe Peak, this is District. You're clear on the 210 through 214 cluster. We've got a Bureau of Land Management /burn active in the Sherman Gulch drainage as of 1400 today. Permit 886-25. Scheduled to run through 2300 tonight. They're working a 30-acre block ahead of the cold front. Your lightning is hitting their burn perimeter. You are not seeing new ignition. You are seeing their permitted activity reflected through the cloud base. Confirmed, District. Logging closed. Striped Peak, who is your relief? There is no relief. I have a written patch agreement on file with District Ranger Volante. A long pause. You're the Olin? Yes, ma'am. Another pause. Stand by, Stripe Peak. The line went quiet. The lightning continued for another half hour, the cell drifting north and east at the speed of a slow truck, the strikes coming at 30 to 40-second intervals, all of them within 10 degrees of azimuth 212. Wes logged each one. He did not call them in again. He sat at the desk with the radio open and the L4 manual open beside it and the September 12, 1963 entry from Brace's log open in his hand. And he waited. The dispatcher came back at 20:35 hours. Stripe Peak, District. Ranger Volante asked me to relay a message. Your radio call has been logged. The district acknowledges. End message. Confirmed, District. Striped Peak going to listening watch. Striped Peak, one more thing. Volante said to tell you the log entry tonight should read, quote, cross bearing not available. Single bearing confirmed against published BLM permit. Logged closed by undersigned at 20:35 hours. Volante said to tell you that is how Brace would have written it. Wes was quiet for a moment. Confirmed, District. So logged. Striped Peak going to listening watch. He set the microphone down. He looked at the log page open on the desk. He took a pencil from the cup on the cab desk. He turned the log over to a clean page at the back. The first one Brace had not used because the active record had ended in September of 1973. He dated the page October the 29th of the current year. He laid out the columns the way Brace had laid them out. Weather, azimuth, observation, action, signature. He wrote it the way Volante had told him to write it. He signed it. W. Olin, Striped Peak Lookout, Bitterroot National Forest. He set the pencil down. He sat at the desk a long time looking at the line he had written and the signature underneath and the column of Brace's 25 years of signatures running down the previous page in faded pencil. Then he closed the log and put it in the cab desk's roll-top drawer next to the temperature log pages from the summer of '73. He banked the wood stove for the night. He went to the bunk in his clothes and lay down and listened to the cell move off northeast over the next 2 hours, the strikes growing fainter, the thunder rolling back through the ridges with the long-delayed report that lightning at distance makes against granite. Until somewhere after midnight, there was only the cold wind on the catwalk and the small, dry settling of the cab and the slow tick of the wood stove cooling down. He slept. In the morning, the storm had passed and the catwalk was glazed white with rime, and the lower cellway was clear, and there was, exactly where the BLM permit had said there would be, a thin, pale gray smoke rising from a single point at azimuth 211 degrees, distance about 11 miles. The slash burn finishing itself out as the morning sun warmed the cold gulch floor. Wes stood on the south catwalk in his jacket and watched the smoke for a while. He took the firefinder canvas off and laid it folded on the desk, and he sighted the smoke through the Osborne aperture and read the azimuth to a single degree and wrote it in the log alongside the previous night's confirmation. The smoke dispersed by 10 in the morning. The cell that had carried the strikes was, by then, somewhere over the high country east of Missoula. The first heavy snow of the season came in the following Tuesday, 4 inches at the cab in 8 hours, the lower elevations dusted, the ridge spine white above the timber. The work shifted into winter rhythm. He kept the wood stove going low through the days and banked it for the nights. He stacked the rest of the cord of lodgepole under the catwalk on the south face and tarped it. He cut new firewood every afternoon from a down snag a quarter-mile east of the cab, dragging the bucked rounds in on a small sledge Buddy had sent up the trail in the second week of November on Hutch's pack string. He worked through the winter on the slower restoration. He replaced the rotted balsa wood floor planks one at a time, cutting new ones to original pattern from a sheet of marine balsa Buddy had located through a salvage contact in Spokane, with the exception of the single loose plank in front of the firefinder pedestal. He left that one as he had found it. The compartment underneath was empty now. The 4 things Brace had left were on the desk, where they would be seen every time someone came into the cab. But he kept the plank loose. There is a difference, he understood, between a hiding place that has done its work and a hiding place that has stopped working. The compartment had done its work. He left it ready, in case someone else, sometime, would need a place to leave something for whoever came next. He sealed the cab walls with marine spar varnish through the long, quiet weeks of December and January. 2 coats inside, 3 coats on the outside trim, working slowly with a small brush in the warmest hours of the cab afternoon. He rebedded the Osborne firefinder collar with shellac, the way the original USFS service manual had specified in 1942. He repaired the small wooden bench on the catwalk landing with new spruce dressed to original pattern. He replaced the copper screen on the window pane sashes from a roll May Krause had sourced for him from a Heritage Hardware in Spokane in the 3rd week of November. He installed a small water catchment off the south eave that he had built from a 100-gallon galvanized barrel Buddy had pulled out of his back lot, painted to USFS green and rigged with a fitted drain to a smaller storage tank inside the cab beneath the bunk. The system would not run in the dead of winter, when everything was frozen, but it would catch the spring melt in the summer thunderstorm rain, and it would give him 40 gallons of standing water through the active season without his having to pack 5-gallon containers up the trail from the spring at the foot of the ridge. He rebuilt the original dry stone foundation cairn at the southwest corner of the base in the 3rd week of January, with the help of Sully McGann, a 61-year-old retired dry stone mason from Coeur d'Alene who came up the trail on snowshoes one Saturday morning with a leather roll of mason's hammers and a small grease pencil sketch of the original cairn pattern he had drawn from a 1946 USFS construction photograph he had pulled out of the district archive on Buddy's recommendation. They worked on the cairn for 2 days. Sully showed Wes the difference between a header and stretcher pattern and a single-course rubble fill. He showed him how to set a queen closer at the corner course so the cairn would not bow under freeze-thaw cycle. He did not say much beyond what was necessary for the work. When the cairn was finished, on the Sunday evening, Sully stood back from it and looked at it for a long time and said only, "That'll hold," and went down the trail the next morning before Wes was awake. In February, on a clear, cold afternoon, with the temperature on the cab thermometer reading -4 Fahrenheit, the District Forest Service Region 1 archivist drove up from Missoula in a Forest Service truck and parked at the trailhead and snowshoed up with Hutch the last 8 miles, carrying a flatbed scanner and a hard case strapped to his pack. His name was Wendell Mass. He was 48 years old, and he had been the regional archivist for 19 years. He had been trying to get permission to copy the Stripe Peak log for 14 of those years. He set the scanner up on the cab desk. He plugged it into a small inverter Wes had charged off the solar panel Hutch had brought up in late November and bolted to the south eave of the cab roof. He scanned the entire log over 2 days, page by page, talking very little, drinking the coffee Wes made him from his own provisions, sleeping in the cab that first night in a sleeping bag he had brought up in his pack. On the second afternoon, with the last page scanned and the original log laid back in the roll-top drawer next to the temperature log pages of 73, Wendell sat at the desk and looked at the 4 things Brace had left, and he said, "The Region 1 archive will index this scan against the district record by the end of next month. The Forest Fire Lookout Association Journal will probably publish an excerpt of the September 12th 63 entry in their spring volume if you'll allow it. They've been asking us for 40 years for a copy of that page in particular. They had heard about it from Pelham at an FFLA meeting in 1993. They didn't know whether it actually existed." "It exists, sir." "Yes, so I see." Wendell paused. He looked at the brass badge on the desk. He looked at the leather pouch. He looked at the $8.50 Wes had laid out in a small row on the desk next to the pouch, in chronological order, 1942 through 46. He looked at the 7 Brownie reference photographs Wes had pinned, again, to the inside of the cab wall above the firefinder, just the way Brace had pinned them in the summer of 48. "You restored the references?" "Yes, sir." "He took them down after one summer because he had memorized the horizons?" "Yes, sir." "You will memorize them too. You may decide to leave them up anyway." "Yes, sir." Wendell nodded. He shouldered his pack. He went out onto the catwalk and stood a moment looking at the visible horizon at azimuth 212 degrees. The lower Selway was white with February snow. The Sherman Gulch drainage was just visible against the south face of the next ridge over. He came back into the cab and shook Wes's hand and said, "The district has agreed to renew the Lookouts Commission as an active fire detection site starting the upcoming fire season. Provisional on the structural condition report UO Volante in March. They have not staffed it in 52 years. You will not be a USFS employee in any formal sense. But your call sign will be back on the active board. The radio relay through the district will be live for the duration of fire season, and you will be considered, by the district and by Region 1, a contributing observer. The Forest Fire Lookout Association will be the certifying body. The district will pay you nothing because the district has no budget. The FFLA has approved a small annual operating stipend for you because they have been waiting 50 years for the opportunity to do exactly this. The stipend is $6,400 a year. It will not make you rich. It will keep you in glass and stain and dry food and radio batteries. The rest is yours to find. Yes, sir, thank you. Don't thank me. I've wanted this for 19 years, and you walked into Volante's office in October and made it possible. You are doing the Forest Service a favor." He went down the ladder. Wes paid the tax-back fee to the district on the 18th of March in cash from the coffee can, 8 $100 bills and 7 20s and 2 $10 bills, and Volante gave him a receipt and the structural condition report stamp on the cab plaque, and she shook his hand and said, "The cab is yours, free and clear. The Forest Service has no further interest in the structure beyond your continuing patch obligations and the fire season relay agreement." Then she handed him a small manila envelope and said, "This came up from Missoula in last week's mail. It's for you." Inside was a single Xerox page from the USFS Region 1 personnel file for Olin Lyle Brace, dated September of 1973, the standard retirement letter form. Across the bottom, in pencil, in the careful printed script that Wes now recognized without having to think about it, Brace had written a single line. "The cab is the work is the cab. Whoever comes next, you will know what to do." Wes folded the page. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, and he kept it there for a long time. Spring came late to the ridge that year. The catchment ran for the first time on the 3rd of April, with a slow, steady stream of snowmelt off the south eave filling the small storage tank under the bunk in about 6 hours. The first ground squirrel emerged from his burrow at the foot of the south face in the second week of April. The Clark's nutcrackers came back to the white bark in late April. The huckleberry leafed out on the lower south slope by the first week of May. The first thunderstorm cell of the new fire season passed over the ridge on the night of June the 11th. 4 lightning strikes total, all of them at distances and azimuths where the district published prescribed burn schedule explained them. All of them logged closed by Wes under Volante's protocol. By the second week of June, the cab was on its first formal staffed lookout schedule since the summer of '73. Wes worked the 12 to 14-hour day on the schedule of the L4 manual, with the radio open on the listening watch and the Osborne firefinder canvas folded on the desk and the 7 Brownie reference photographs pinned to the inside wall above it. The district put him on a once-an-hour position check during the active afternoon hours and a twice-a-shift 2-bearing cross-check against the staffed Hell's Half-Acre lookout in the central Bitterroot and a second staffed lookout on the St. Joe district to the north. The cross-bearing system was not the system Brace had worked under, but it was the modern equivalent, and Wes worked it carefully. He logged everything in the new fire log he had begun on the night of October 29th the previous year, with the column format Brace had used, with the careful printed script he had been practicing through the winter to make it match the one in the cab's original log without exactly copying it. It is worth saying here what the work actually is because the public picture of a fire tower lookout keeper is mostly wrong. It is not a man sitting on a catwalk watching sunsets in solitude. It is 12 to 14 hours a day of slow mechanical scanning across a known horizon in a specific protocol against a memorized baseline with adjacent lookout calls every 2 hours during fire weather, with a paper log of every smoke and every lightning strike and every weather entry, and with a strict district-issued azimuth confirmation requirement before any smoke is logged as confirmed. The brownies on the wall are not pictures of a beautiful place. They are reference instruments. The pointer disc on the firefinder is not a curiosity. It is a working sighting tool. The cab is not a refuge. It is a working station whose only purpose is to detect early-stage wildland fire. It is, in the strictest sense, an industrial worksite, and the men and women who have kept it across the 20th century have understood it that way. They have not been hermits. They have been technical workers in a remote office. There are, according to the most recent Forest Fire Lookout Association directory I have been able to consult, approximately 280 active staffed fire tower lookouts in the continental United States as of the most recent reporting year. There are approximately 1,100 Civilian Conservation Corps-era structures still standing in some condition on Forest Service and national park lands, of which a few dozen are in any state of active use. There are, in the state of Montana, approximately 870 off-grid dwelling permits on USFS or BLM land, of which Striped Peak Lookout, after its renewal in March, is one of the very few that is also a federally listed historic fire detection structure with an active fire season commission. The number of young people in their 20s who have made the move to take on a structure of this kind has been climbing slowly through the last decade, as the FFLA and a handful of state historical societies have begun to put the disposal list lookouts in front of people who are paying attention. The number is still small. The number is not negligible. What this means in plain language is that the work of keeping a fire tower lookout is not dead, that it has not been dead, that it has been kept alive by a small network of retired Forest Service hands and historical society volunteers and old packers and old lookout keepers themselves, who have been waiting, in some cases for 40 years, for the right kind of young man or woman to walk into a district office in October and ask the right kind of question. The work is there for whoever wants it. The structures are there. The country is there. The fires increasingly are there. The lookouts are not there as nostalgia. They are there because early-stage wildland fire detection from a fixed high-altitude vantage with an Osborne firefinder operated by a trained human eye is, even in 2026, a more reliable detection method for the first 90 minutes of a remote ignition than satellite-based infrared scanning. And the smoke azimuth call from a staffed lookout is, even now, the call the district wants first when the cell is over a roadless area. The work has not been replaced. It has only been understaffed. That is what Striped Peak is. Wes understood it by the end of his first active fire season week. The first real summer he kept the cab through, the fire season ran light. The total of 15 confirmed smokes through the active months. Of those, 11 were prescribed burns logged closed against the published BLM and USFS permit schedules. 3 were new start ignitions, all of them confirmed by Wes's cross bearings with Hell's Half Acre and the street. Joe District Relay and acknowledged by the district within the hour. One of the 3 was contained at less than 5 acres by a single engine crew dispatched out of the Magruder station within 90 minutes of Wes's call. The other 2 were larger and ran into long fight cycles through the latter half of August. Neither one threatened any settlement. Both were eventually contained by ground crews working off trail from staging areas at the heads of the affected drainages, with Wes's continuing azimuth confirmations from the cab feeding into the district's daily incident map for as long as the smoke remained visible on his horizon. His own fire log filled at about the same rate Brace's had filled in his early seasons. He kept it in the same column format. He signed each season's last page with the same plain W. Olin signature. He kept the pencil sharp with a small folding knife on the desk. He did not, of his own decision, attempt to imitate Brace's handwriting beyond the level of practical readability. He had not been called to be Brace. He had been called to be the next man, which is a different thing. May Krause came up the trail twice that summer, once in early July with the FFLA Spring Journal that had printed the September 12th 63 entry across 2 pages, and once in late August with another jar of huckleberry preserves and a small handwritten note from Pelham Stowe and Wallace that read, simply, "The work goes on. P.S." Wes pinned the note to the inside cab wall above the firefinder, next to the 7 Brownie reference photographs. Buddy came up 4 times across the summer, each time with a single small piece of equipment or a single small tool he thought Wes would need next, never bringing more than one thing, never charging for it. Hutch came up once a month, the F-100 always at the trailhead by sunrise, the Dixie Hound increasingly old and slow, but still riding shotgun, the conversations on the catwalk lasting as long as the coffee in the thermos, and never any longer. Pelham Stowe died in his sleep on the 2nd of September, in his small apartment over May's bookstore on Bank Street in Wallace, at the age of 86. The funeral was held on the 7th of September at the small Catholic church in Wallace. Wes came down off the ridge for the funeral. He sat in the back of the church with Hutch and Buddy and May and Wendell Mass, who had driven up from Missoula. He went up to the ridge the next morning. He wrote a single line in the fire log at the bottom of the September 7th entry in the action column. P. Stowe, Goose Peak Lookout, 1946 to 1971. Last cross-bearing partner of the cab's first keeper, died September 2nd this year. Funeral September 7th. Logged for the record. He signed it. He went back to work. The first snow of his second autumn on the ridge came on October the 19th, 3 inches at the cab in 5 hours. A clean, dry snow that whitened the catwalk timbers and went away the next morning. The first hard freeze came on the 29th. The first lightning storm of his second full active season had come on the 11th of June. The first marten paw print on the snow of the South Catwalk landing came on the 3rd of November. A single neat line of 5-toed tracks crossing the catwalk and disappearing into the soffit of the south eave, where, Wes understood after a week of careful observation, the marten had begun to den. He left her alone. He noted the den site in the log. He noted the marten's nightly comings and goings for the rest of November. He gave her the soffit. He learned to sleep through the small sounds she made at midnight on her way out to the south face for whatever it was she was hunting in the early hours. By the end of November, the first full year had closed. His coffee can held $1,120 again. Between the FFLA stipend and the Historical Society contract, May Krause and the Idaho Mining Museum in Wallace had arranged through the winter, which paid him a modest monthly sum to act as the keeper of the original brace log for the purposes of the museum's planned permanent exhibit on the fire detection history of the Bitterroot. The Wallace Press-Times had printed a small piece on the renewed commission of Striped Peak in the 3rd week of June, written by a young reporter named Annie Kessler, who had hiked up the trail with Buddy and May and stayed 3 hours in the cab, and the piece had been picked up by the Regional Forest Service press release and by the Forest Fire Lookout Association quarterly newsletter. And Wes had begun, in the slow winter hours of the cab, to write down what he was doing in a small offline journal that he had no particular plan to publish, but that, by late autumn, had begun to circulate, by way of May's bookstore and the FFLA newsletter, among a small readership of FFLA members and Forest Service retirees, and a handful of younger people who had begun, in numbers not yet large enough to be a movement, but large enough to be a count, to ask about the disposal lists of their own home Forest Service districts. He was not rich. He had never been going to be rich. He had enough carefully managed, and he had work that was real work, and he had a place that was the place. The three things taken together are more than most people get in a life. He understood that. He understood it without sentimentality and without smugness. He kept the cab and the catwalk and the firefinder and the log and the martin and the south eave the way Brace had kept them, which is to say plainly and without fuss, on the assumption that the work was the point, and that the work would continue past him in some form to be determined by the next person who walked into a district office in October and asked the right kind of question. If this story has reached you and you have someone in your life who has been waiting for the right letter to come back from a small district office somewhere they have never been, share it with them. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The cab is on a ridge in the Bitterroots, and the wind on the catwalk does not stop, and we love hearing how far these stories travel. On a clear, cold morning in the last week of November, with the sky over the lower Selway gone the color of a polished brass coin, and the first true winter light beginning to set up across the ridges, Wes Olin climbed the catwalk ladder at 5:40 in the morning with the new fire log in his hand and the Connecticut pattern axe leaning, as he had left it the night before, in the cab corner by the door. He opened the cab. He banked up the wood stove. He set the radio on listening watch for the district's 7 o'clock weather broadcast. He took the log to the desk. He opened it. He turned the new log to a clean page. He dated it the date he had climbed up that morning. He wrote, in the careful printed script he had practiced through 14 months of cab work to make it readable but not imitative, a single line. First true winter morning of the second year. Sky clear, wind northwest, 3 knots. No smoke, no lightning. Martin in South Eve continues to den. All systems quiet. He signed it, W. Olin, Stripe Peak Lookout, Bitterroot National Forest. He set the log down on the desk beside the original. The original was open to the page that read, in pencil, in the careful printed script he now knew by heart, cross-bearing from Goose Peak negative, cross-bearing from Lookout Mountain negative, foot reconnaissance initiated by undersigned at 1700. The new log was open to the page in his own hand. The two pages lay side by side on the desk. The hands were different. The columns were the same. Brace had kept the cab for 25 summers. Wes Olin had kept it for 1. There was, in front of him, the work of the rest. He turned to the south window and looked out at the visible horizon, at azimuth 212 degrees. The lower Selway was clean and white and quiet. There was no smoke. There was no lightning. There was only the work of paying attention to a country that had been there a long time before him and would be there a long time after, and the slow, steady pleasure of knowing that what he was doing in the cab had been done in the same cab by another man for 25 summers, and that what that man had done had been worth keeping, and that he, Wes Olin, who had walked into Hutch's outfitter shop in Wallace on a Sunday afternoon in late September with $30 in his pocket and no plan past the next 24 hours, had been given the small honor of keeping it next. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the kettle on the wood stove. He sat down at the desk. He went to work. Some lookouts go dark and stay dark. Some go dark and wait. Some things left behind are not lost at all. They are waiting for the right man to come up the ridge and find them, and to know, when he gets there, what to do.